Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Jillian Goodman. I'm an editor at Bloomberg Green, and I'd like to introduce our guests, Dr. Carol O'Donnell, the director of Smithsonian Science Education Center, and Tchernavia Rocker, Chief People and Culture Officer at Under Armour. So welcome to you both.
Thank you for
Good
having
morning.
I'd like to start by just asking each of you to describe your roles a little bit. This panel is about Gen Z and sustainability, and especially keeping Gen Z engaged and employed. And I think you each have a very you have very different and interesting perspectives on that question. So Tchernavia, why don't we start with you?
Hi. So in addition to having my regular HR responsibilities, building performance management systems, building leadership development programs, the reason my title is actually more descriptive than most is that this real fundamental of people and culture. People makes companies, and culture is the manifestation of the everyday lived experience of teammates. So I spend a lot of time in the details of the teammate experience in terms of their experience with their leadership, the way they want to experience the company, the way in which they engage with each other. So we take a much more holistic, kind of consumer-centric mindset, if that makes sense, when we think about what those day-to-day experiences are for teammates, and really trying to craft them in a way, curate those experiences so we can get at the moments that matters most for teammates. And so, yes, we do all of our traditional HR things, but we're also really focused on how to transform a workplace and a workplace of the future.
Mm-hmm. And Carol, could you describe your work with the Smithsonian? And inside and outside, I suppose.
Yes, and I think would say it's very different. We at the Smithsonian, which is this massive museum, education, and research complex, our sole vision is to increase and diffuse knowledge. And so we at the Smithsonian Science Education Center, which is just one of 30 plus different organizations that make up the Smithsonian complex, we are focused specifically on grades K through 12. And so we are looking at the much younger generation. You might even include Generation Alpha in there, these very little guys who are only 5 or 7 years old. And so we are looking at what is it that we can do for very young students to prepare them for a future that we really don't fully understand. Lots of predictions are made, but what is it that can happen in grades K to 12 in educating youth on STEM education in particular to prepare them for a workforce that and a society that is has a lot of questions ahead of us. So that's our job.
Mm-hmm. So, I got a chance to catch up with you both before today. And one of the things that Tchernavia, you and I talked about is something actually that, something that we talked about is the needs of Gen X being different from the needs of Gen Y, millennials, my generation, being different from the needs of Gen Z. And I was wondering, in practice, what that means for you, how you've tried to address those different needs in your work, and the big questions for you, I guess, in your work.
Sure. So when we think about how we have differentiated Gen X, Gen Y, Millennial, Z, and of course soon coming Alpha, we tend to think of the biggest differences, right? So I think at the core, you have to always decide that everybody wants to have purpose and meaning. So that is consistent and true across the generation. So we start with that frame, but then we also think about each employee segment in terms of how they came into the world, this moment in time in the world, and how does that frame their experiences? I'm an X, right? And so I have some Z kids, and our worldview is based on the way we came into the world, and what critical things were happening at the time of our birth. Were we experiencing recessions? Were we experiencing greater advancements in technologies? I think the biggest difference with Z that I see is that they are true digital natives. And so they have a set of tools and voice that we haven't seen in any previous generation. And they are okay using that voice. And so I see that, some of the things that we tend to take for granted is that they also bring along the other generations, right? And creating voice and using social media, using technology to really advance causes, to have voice. In traditional workplaces, there's kind of these hierarchies that historically existed. But when you have open voice, because you have voice, whether you're internal to the business, whether you're online somewhere, it just creates a level of voice that this generation requires that you listen more, because they will speak whether you're listening or not. And so I think that differentiation is just what's a little different than the other generations. And they're pulling the rest of us along. So they also create coalitions, and it's pretty exciting to see what can be done, because they're willing to use their voice and use the tools that they have at their disposal in this generation that we didn't have before.
Totally. It's funny, thinking about growing up in this day and age, like I'm really glad that I didn't have Instagram in middle school. I'm really glad that I didn't have TikTok when I was that young. But on the other hand, as you say, there is an empowering aspect of it. This generation is so savvy, and as you say, is so outspoken. And I wonder, though, from an internal HR standpoint, when you have people in management, probably the upper management, who maybe doesn't think it's super appropriate that someone's, tweeting out their views, or feels that they can just walk into the CEO's office and say what's important to them. So I guess this has always struck me as a big challenge of dealing with these generational issues is, how do you deal with these generational issues in your workplace?
Yeah, and again, it goes back to something that sounds overly simplified, is we always come back to our core values and our purpose. What are we trying to achieve collectively? Because we hope that they're there. Under Armour, we make you better. We make athletes better. We exist because we empower those who strive for more. And because we have a very clear purpose, because we have very clear values internal to the business, we use those to drive conversations, even if those conversations are sometimes uncomfortable. We also use those to, try to create some semblance of how we engage with one another. And so when we say that we last week we had a leadership meeting where we really were focusing our attention on radical candor, right? How do we have open conversations all the time? And then how do you behave that way in front of your teammates so they can have that same conversation with you, always in a respectful manner? And I don't think trying to quell voices doesn't really help you. What you get the most of is trying to listen. Whenever we try to suffocate voices or stuff them out, we're actually really stuffing out creativity, debate that's really needed to move the needle forward. So instead of trying to control it, you try to create the environments that it can happen in a healthy way.
And, the other thing I think that this access to technology and this fluency, native fluency with technology has produced is a degree of fluency with just information. And Carol, this is something that you and I talked about, is STEM education from very early on, and the need to, reach people when they are, 5, 6, 7, when they are in that K through 12 period. And so I was hoping you can describe, your experiences with young people and with creating the workforce of the future.
Yeah, I would say historically, STEM education, which was never even referred to as that in this very kind of interdisciplinary way until maybe a couple of decades ago, but we never really paid attention to the workforce. So, educators didn't really have conversations with people like Tchernavia. We were ignoring the fact that we were preparing students for something that they would enter into once they left school. It was really just about content. And that was it. We were trying to educate students to learn facts and knowledge, which, by the way, changes over time. Pluto was a planet, 30 years ago, but it isn't considered to be a planet today. So teaching students just content alone isn't good enough anymore. So there's this much more integrated, even transdisciplinary approach to learning that prepares students for a time at which, if that content or knowledge or those facts do change over time, that they're prepared with the skills that they need. So, today, educators take a much more futuristic and focused approach to educating youth, where we're not focused on the disciplines themselves specifically. So it's not so much teaching you science, technology, engineering, and math. It's teaching you what one of my board members calls strategies that engage minds, the disciplinary skills and the practices that are needed that will kind of transform no matter what environment you're in. So whether it's collecting evidence, reasoning from evidence, argumentation, making certain that students are thinking critically, solving problems. And those are the types of skills that, as we know, many of the people who are in the workforce are looking for in their future candidates. The other thing that we've really started to recognize is that as we have shifted from teaching in a very disciplinary way to a more multidisciplinary way, to then interdisciplinary, to now very transdisciplinary, we are now recognizing that students have to think about the problems that they understand exist within their community or in the world itself. And many of the panels that have come before us have talked about climate change or biodiversity loss or the plastic production and consumption. And so the question becomes, we can educate students not just on scientific topics, but on its application in the real world. So it's a much more socio-scientific approach to teaching. And I think that a lot of corporations are looking for, they recognize that many youth who will be looking for jobs in the future are looking for companies that align with their interests and their beliefs. So let's say, for example, the panel before us talked about Fridays, future Fridays for Futures or Future for Fridays, and Fridays for Future, where Greta Thunberg and others are recognizing that going to school and learning content and skills is not good enough. They want to be able to act on that knowledge. And so at the Smithsonian and Smithsonian Science Education Center in particular, we're trying to educate children on not only the underlying science of, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which has mapped out these goals for the future, 2030, but we're also trying to get them to act against them. And I would love to talk more about ways that we're trying to actually get students to move from just executing an action that someone tells them to do, like, oh, hey, recycle plastic, make certain that you are not consuming too much, to them actually being much more informed and understanding why they're doing that, to being much more considered about those actions, recognizing that if I make a decision, it's not just an environmental one, it's also an economic one. It might be a social one, it might be a cultural action. So absolutely, bringing those perspectives together. And I think the future workforce wants students who are thinking that way. Multiple perspectives.
Yeah, Tchernavia, as you're listening to this, I guess, how are you thinking about bringing the next generation into the workforce and supporting them? And, this is what's coming. How do you think about
Thanks, Cal.
We're doing it in
your workplace? Yeah, got a little preview there.
Yeah, well, I think Carol makes a really great point when she asked this. There was one little word, and it's a word we use so common in English language that we forget. Why? This generation wants to understand why, and why is actually the equivalent of purpose. I don't want to do something for the sake of doing something. I want to do something because it has meaning. I don't want to do rope activities, I don't want to do this thing that you say is important versus what's important to me. So I think for organizations to be successful going forward, they have to understand, one, their own purpose, why they exist, and then different people will be attracted to that. I think when we talked, Jillian, we were laughing because, if you go after everything that everybody wanted you to, you wouldn't be anything, right? You would stand for absolutely nothing because you would sit down for anything, right? And so being very clear about who you are as an organization. And as we think about what it means to empower this next generation, the workforce, you have to words really, really, really matter. Empower. That means they already have power. They already have a point of view. They already have a perspective. So how do you enable that? How do you give them the tools to do that? Give them the creative space to do that? I will tell you things that we began to do at Under Armour. I came in last year and we really took a step back with the organization and say, how do we empower teammates? We have what's called teammate resource groups where teammates can really coalesce around topics that makes most sense to them, particularly in the D&I space. We also have a team that's focused on sustainability in terms of our Green Machine teammate resource group. But we also did things like stepping back and giving teammates more hours to volunteer their time to matters that makes the most sense for them, right? And so in addition to their vacation time and, our holiday time, they actually have, a whole another 40 hours plus any other time that they need to invest in things that make sense for them. And so when we say empower, it really is about how do you enable that? They're going to have voice, again, regardless. You just hope that voice and who you attract to your brand, to your company, is you want to attract critical thinkers. You actually want people who believe in something, right? And so I think this generation, I think this because it holds us accountable, and I think this generation is one that will hold us accountable for being for living up to all the ideas of conscious capitalism in a way that we haven't seen before, right? That capitalism and care for others, care for the earth is possible all in the same prism. And so I'm excited more than anything because my kids push me in a way, I still have that parental relationship that's a little off at times. I want them to have voice, but it's usually with other people. And I was like, that was for other people, how you have a conversation, not me. But the debate, I think it's important. And I think the work that the Smithsonian is doing, that Jillian, you're doing, even bringing these topics to life in a practical way, Carol, the education is going to be important for organizations. I don't care how much you try to hold on to it, it falls down. And so how do you embrace it? How do you incorporate it? How do you adopt it? And I think as we build more critical thinkers, as we think about people who are not so self-centered, I always just say being an Xer, like we were the first kind of latchkey kid groups, and we were quite independent. And we kind of centered on self a good bit. But this group is about the collective, and I think organizations will be smart to really begin to adapt practices. You can't shift your whole organization, turn it on its head. Every organization has an ethos. Every organization has its own origin story. But it's important to listen. And what I've found, is that by creating voice for some, you create voice for most. And if you believe that voice is important in other public discourse outside of the workplace, you have to create it and nurture it inside the workplace.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so impressive to see the way, Carol, you talked about Fridays for Future and the way this generation is really building movements among themselves. Again, like really natively. And I guess one thing that I think about, and that, I think a lot of people think about with regard to this generation and activism is, we've seen the boomer generation was notoriously activist until they weren't. I think we all assume that our generation is different. We all assume that like this thing is going to be the thing that sticks, that we're unique, whatever. And so I guess, when we think about the future, and how I don't know, it's not like it's so simple a project as like incorporating this generation into our lives. That's very simplistic and not the way anything actually works. But I guess just as we look to the future, what do you expect of this generation? How, as they, mature into adults, what do you expect of this generation? Carol, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think they may demand more of the people that they work for. And I would love, Tchernavia, your kind of perspective on this. It feels as if they understand that, at least this is the way we're approaching it, is that we're trying to get them to recognize around in their place, what are the problems that exist and what can they do to contribute to those problems? So giving them agency. And a lot of students, when we start in on the programming that we engage in, which we call Smithsonian Science for Global Goals, many of the students don't believe that they can make a difference in their community. And so it's not just teaching them science or technology or engineering and math, it's also about teaching them these social and emotional skills. I talked earlier about the importance of perspective taking. If you work and you talk about this, like working on a team, right? So you've got these teammates. We have to we start from a very young age of getting students to work in collaborative groups, making certain that they recognize that not everyone in that group is going to have the same perspective or the same views on an issue. And developing those social emotional learning skills early is really, really critical to their decision making, which is an important skill that you talked about that they need as they get older. The other thing I think too is that we want them to you talked about empowerment. We want them to to recognize that there is more to work than just the paycheck at the end of the day, although that absolutely is crucial. But we want them to, they're not going to stay with a company that I don't believe they agree with. And so we're trying to get them at a very young age to recognize that they can ask questions. They can look for places that agree with them in terms of the way that the kinds of decisions they're making. So for us, it's not just about educating them in terms of content and skills, but it's also about making certain that they are asking the right questions, are acting against those questions, and that they're also bringing that knowledge home to their parents. So, I'm a mother of 4 adult children. I think you said you're also a mother of your children are adults as well. It's too. And it's really important that we're having these intergenerational conversations. So another job of educators of K through 12 is that we know that what students are learning in school, they're bringing home to their families. They're having conversations either over the dinner table or as they're heading out the door. And those intergenerational conversations do have an influence on the way adults think. I know that I learn from my own children and the conversations I have with them. We have evidence from somebody by the name of Lawson, who published a paper in Nature that talks about the importance of intergenerational conversation. So if we educate our youth, for example, on climate change at school, they're going to bring that knowledge home, and they're going to influence the way other generations think about the topic. So I think that's really crucial.
Yeah, and so as you try and, build your organization into the future, Tchernavia, like how are you thinking about, I guess, what is the long range of your planning? How are you thinking about this group as they grow? And then, of course, forward planning for yourselves, incorporating yet younger people into that culture.
Yeah, as we think about, Carol talked about at the very top of our time together, not only just Gen Z, but we're beginning to think about Generation Alpha, right? Like, what do they need? Because organizations take time to shift, and most organizations, whether it be companies, whether it be a government, whether it be whole countries, are always in the midst of change. And I think when I think about long range, what we want to create is we want to create the aspirations that and the ideas of empowerment. We want people to feel a sense of equality and inclusivity that allows them and allows them and enables them to engage across a wide range of topics that are important to them. If we believe what we truly believe as a company, if we believe that we empower those who strive for more, then we have to change the shape of our organization in terms of who has power, who has voice. What do they need to be successful? I was laughing with my husband a few weeks ago. We no longer have the chains of retirement plans that we did in the 80s and 70s, and some of us still had them in the 90s. So you don't have those typical kind of chains of why people stay at companies, right? I need a pension. You only have purpose. People stay because they believe that you do something that matters in the world, and they're a part of helping you do that, and that you create for them agency again to do the things that matter for them. And so organizations have to really understand what brings people, what keeps people, what motivates people. And even if I would just say, even if teammates come and they don't stay long, hopefully we've imparted to them a level of empowerment to bring their voice to work, to bring meaning to their work, so they can really change the world. When I think about teammates today that I'm sitting, I think I was telling you, Jillian, when we were talking, the average age of our workforce is about 31, 32 years old. So a relatively average young group. And so you can only imagine, the types of this, kind of the spread of conversations that we have. And one thing that I hear most from my teammates is they want to continue. They think it's complete, but we know that isn't actually how the world works out. They want to continue the work that the prior generations did not complete in terms of creating a more just, fair, equitable world. They want to continue that work. And they express it in very clear terms, in ways that my generation didn't, my parents' generation didn't. They're very clear. that what's most important to them is that we have diversity, that we have equality, that we care for the earth that's been entrusted to us, and that we do unto others better than we would even want unto ourselves.